Hey friends, I'm really excited to have my friend David Nelms on the Church Planting Podcast for this episode. David is the founder and president of the Timothy Initiative. It's a church planting, really a multiplication organization that's planting tens and tens of thousands of churches around the world. Really exciting about how they're transitioning and transferring all of their church planting principles, multiplication principles, what they've learned in countries around the world into the United States right now. And David is with us to talk about discipleship, what that means, how to start a movement of multiplication in our churches. I'm so excited to welcome my friend and colleague, David Nelms, who's the leader of the Timothy Initiative, to the Church Planting Podcast. Welcome, David.
Greg, I am thrilled to be with you here. I love Stadia. I'm all things Stadia, okay? So thrilled to be here with you.
Well, thank you. But you have so much to say to all of our listeners and viewers. David, you and I have had the opportunity to spend some time together finally in the past year, and to get time face to face, in person as well as on Zoom. And I've just been so impressed and thought this is the leader that I want to learn from, and that I think our listeners and viewers can learn a great deal from as well. David, talk to us a little about, we're great partners with Church Planting. Talk to us a little bit about the Timothy Initiative, if you don't mind.
Yeah, Greg, TTI, the Timothy Initiative, we take our name from 2 Timothy 2:2, which I believe is the most important verse in the Bible dealing with making disciple makers.
Expound on that, David.
Well, in that verse, you see the expectation of multiplication. Paul discipled Timothy, who discipled faithful people, who discipled others also. See, I don't believe the Great Commission is just making disciples. I believe it's making disciples who make disciples. Because when Jesus spoke in Matthew 28, when he said, go make disciples of every nation, he then said, teach them to obey everything I have commanded you. He just commanded them to make disciples. So what he was really saying was make disciples who make disciples who make disciples who make disciples. So that realization finally worked through my brain, and we came to realize that that's what we're supposed to be doing. So I was pastoring a church in South Florida at the time, and we came up with this idea, let's plant 7,000 churches. I'm an old church planter like you.
Yeah. Just a small vision though. 7,000 church plants.
Well, they were little churches, okay, but 7,000 house fellowships across several countries in Asia, and so that's kind of how we got started. It was started in a local church. And by the way, I just want to say this to your partners: we believe, as you do, the local church is the front lines. We would
Absolutely.
say TTI is not the front lines. We're simply an extension of the local church, but the local church is where it's all at.
Okay, so there's so much to unpack in what you just shared, and it was one of the reasons it kind of rocked my world when you were sharing that with me. Okay, so vision to plant 7,000 churches before we dive into all the discipleship stuff, which is what we're going to learn from today. So where are you at today? Give us kind of an update. Where are you at in that 7,000 goal? How many churches are you in? What's going on?
Yeah, well, originally it was a 3-year goal. It was a 3-year project, and I'm your typical senior pastor. I had a start date, finish date, and then I don't want to be paying for it the rest of my life. But it took off, and we're beginning our fifth. We just started our 15th year. We're 14 years old, and we have just passed the 113,000 mark of churches that have been started. So listen, we believe we're just getting started. We're just now figuring out the right questions to ask. Okay.
Okay. So David, I'm, all of us are just kind of flabbergasted. You had a goal of 7,000 churches. You're now well over 100,000 churches planted. How many countries are you in?
Currently, we are in 31 countries. We have operated, I think, in about 35 or 40, but currently we're in 31.
Okay. And give us the average size. When you say church and house fellowships, like how many people are involved in each of these church plants on average?
Yeah, average is going to be about 20 people. we use the elephant rabbit analogy. We'd be rabbit churches, small but designed to multiply. As opposed, keep in mind, Greg, most of our work is among unreached people groups.
Yes.
UPGs, which tend to be Hindu, Muslim, Buddhist, animist. And I like to say a lot of these groups are unreached for a reason. They don't want to be reached. In many places, it's illegal to do what we're doing. You can't build buildings. You can't be real open with preaching the gospel. So the churches tend to be smaller, and again, they're designed to reproduce.
Okay. So, so 20 to 30 people, we'll just use the small average there, 20 people, 113,000 churches. That's well over 2 million people that have been reached with the gospel. Now this leads me back to the rapid multiplication. So this is a movement. So talk about how that works, David.
Yeah, well, it's really amazing, Greg. Multiplication always trumps addition, always. It's a little slow on the front end. You use the old illustration of you double $1 a day. It takes a couple of weeks before you've got any money there doubling that dollar, but you keep doubling it every day for a month. And at some point, it just takes off. And that's what we're seeing. I just saw a report 2 weeks ago that just blew me away in a 5 or 6 country project that we're doing in East Africa, which is one of my favorite places. Our training goes for 2 years. A batch of students goes for 2 years. During that 2 years, we train 2,400 Timothys. A Timothy is a church planter. Those 2,400 Timothys planted 2,900 churches. However, the Timothy, the next generation, we call that person Titus, they planted 3,400 churches. The second generation planted more than the first generation, and we had over 300 third generation churches. And on top of that, the trainers, the Pauls, they planted another 100, 150 churches. So that's in 2 years. We have never seen multiplication like that on such a large scale. When you're talking about 2,400 church planters being trained at one time. I've seen it with 50 church planters, but never that large. So multiplication is, listen, I drank the Kool-Aid, man. I'm not going back. I love what I'm seeing.
Okay, so David, we're seeing this kind of multiplication with the Timothy Initiative, in Africa, in Asia. Talk about, it's a challenge in the United States, in the West in general. Would you mind diving into that a little bit?
Yeah, well, the USA is a whole different animal, okay? And this past year, we saw 101 Discovery Bible Studies / micro churches started across the states. Our goal was 100. This year, we've set a goal to see 300 started. Now, these are going to be, in the USA, they're going to be even smaller. They're going to be about 10 people each, okay? 10, 12 people each.
Okay.
So what I just said is nothing to write home about, but it is a start. And if we can go from 100 to 300 and then 300 to 500 and 500 to 1,000, in a few years, we're going to start seeing some significant traction. There are several factors that get in the way of the movement world here in the United States. And one of them is there has to be a major paradigm shift away from church growth to church health. And by a healthy church, I would define a healthy church as a disciple-making church, okay? So there has to be a focused intentionality, not on getting larger, but on raising up disciple makers who will in turn reproduce. And I would say in the United States, I don't think our systems are broken. Somebody said our systems are perfectly designed to get the results we're getting. Our churches are designed primarily to attract large groups of people that we can give the gospel to. And that's good. I praise God for that. That's not bad. That's a very good thing. But but there needs to be a more focused intentionality on raising up disciple makers as opposed to primarily focusing on church growth. Does that make sense?
Well, it does, and it's painful, and I think as our listeners know, I led a very rapidly growing mega church here in Northern Ohio for 25 years before realizing really the full implications and leveraging out church planting and multiplication. And that's largely because in the United States, we celebrate growth, right? We're not really celebrating. We're just now starting to celebrate multiplication. And so it comes back to this principle that you and I were sitting on my couch discussing not too many months ago of the Great Commission. So unpack that again for us, David, the heart of the Great Commission.
Yeah, well, and before I do, let me just state, because I don't want to give any misconception here. I too have pastored a mega church, and I wish we had a mega church in every city on the face of the earth.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, we're not I'm not one of those anti-big church guys. Not far from it. Okay, far from it. However, the cost and the ability to reproduce those things, it's very difficult. And there's an estimated 5 million settlements in the world today that are in need of a church. And how in the world are we going to do that in the next 50, 100 years if we don't change our strategy up a little bit?
Yeah, David, there's more than 1 billion children on the planet under the age of 18, thinking about the next generation, who have no access to the good news of Jesus Christ.
Yeah. So we can't, we've got to be open to looking at different ways of doing it. So we're not saying don't have mega churches. I want to have all of them I can have. We're saying the focus needs to be on making disciple makers, however large or small the church is, because that's the Great Commission. All my life, I thought the best way to make disciples was by planting churches. I came to realize the best way to plant churches was by making disciples. I had it backwards. And as I looked at the Great Commission afresh and anew, Jesus didn't say go plant churches. He said, go make disciples. And all my life, as I read the book of Acts and Greg through the epistles, I had in my mind that Paul and those guys were going into cities to start churches. I'm not convinced they were. I'm more convinced they were going where they went to make disciples. But because that's what Jesus told them to do. But when you go into a city and you lead someone to Christ and you begin discipling that person, and they in turn reach their loved one, their friend, their neighbor, pretty soon those new believers will gather together. When they gather together, they'll worship the Father, they'll study the scriptures, they'll pray, they'll fellowship together. The byproduct of making disciple makers is churches spring up. But the focus was not on planting churches, it was on making disciple makers. And if I can be a little bit caustic here, if I can have permission to do that, I would say we have mastered the art in the United States of we have learned how to spend $1 million to plant churches without making hardly any new disciples. Okay.
Ouch. Yes.
So,
yes.
And again, I hope we can build these churches as big as possible, but the focus needs to be on making disciples who make disciples, because that's the Great Commission.
Okay, am I correct in hearing you? Because I want to make sure this point's driven home for all of us, that a person is not a disciple unless they are making disciples.
Well, that's what I've come to believe. I heard somebody say once, I was sitting in a pastor's office in Iowa, and the pastor looked at me. We were talking about this very subject. He said, David, if you're not making disciples who make disciples, you're not making disciples, because disciples make disciples. And it's like, I thought my head was going to explode. I said, wait a minute, say that again. He said, if you're not making disciples who make disciples, you're not making disciples, because disciples make disciples. The first page of the Bible tells us everything reproduces after its own kind. And those early disciples that Jesus trained, the 12 apostles, they made disciples. And again, Matthew 28, the commission is make disciples and then teach them to do everything I've commanded you. He just commanded them to make disciples. So I see it all through. I didn't see it before, but I see it now. Disciples make disciples. If your disciple hasn't made a disciple, I'm not sure that you've made a disciple.
Okay, this is just such gold. David, let's say you're going through this process, and so let's just say we're gathering 10 people in our home, we're sitting down. In the West, we'd start with a Bible study, right? You guys do kind of a more pragmatic approach to scripture study. Could you unpack that a bit?
Yeah, we now if we're talking about reaching out to unchurched, lost people, we would begin with what's called a Discovery Bible Study, or a DBS. Okay, and a DBS, it was designed by a great missionary leader named David Watson. Yep. And DBS was designed over in Asia to bring unchurched, lost people, primarily from unreached people groups, to a point, basically discipling them to a decision for Jesus Christ. But it's designed not just to teach the new believer about Jesus and teach them the scriptures, but it's really designed to teach them how to teach the scriptures to the next generation. It's a reproducible method, which, by the way...
Okay, so explain it a little bit.
Yeah. Well, a real quick, and by the way, your listeners can just Google DBS, Discovery Bible Study. They'll get a lot better explanation than from me.
Awesome.
But my condensed version would be, start with the gospel stories of Jesus, the red letter stories. There's a bunch of them. Most of them are about 10 or 15 verses. You got 3 or 4 people there. Have somebody read the 10 or 15 verses, the red letter story. Have somebody else read it again. Then ask somebody, put it in your own words. What did you just hear? Ask somebody else, what did they leave out? Put it in your own words. What did they just hear? Or what did we just hear? And then there's 4 questions you can ask. And the questions can vary, but the questions I use are, what did we learn about God in this passage? What did we learn about people in this passage? The third question varies depending upon the text. It could be, in this passage, is there a command to obey, or a temptation to avoid, or a promise to claim, or an example to follow? It just depends on the text.
Okay.
And then the fourth question is, who do you know that needs to hear this story? And so the idea is we send them out now to share the story. Once a few of them accept Christ, after that fourth question, we would then stop and pray and say, let's each ask the Lord, what would you have me to do based on this passage from your word that I just read? And then whatever they tell us they're hearing from the Lord, that's their assignment. We hold them accountable to do that. So it's what's called obedience-based discipleship with accountability. We don't just hear the word, but James 1, if we hear it without doing it, we have deceived ourselves. And by the way, I think our churches are filled with self-deceived people who, because we know it, we think that's maturity. But knowing it and doing it are 2 different things. So that would be...
Okay. So talk about the accountability piece. So how do we hold people accountable?
Well, you just got to ask them. When we started TTI, there was no accountability to share Christ, and the numbers were as flat as a pancake. But when we started saying we want each of our Timothys to share their story with 5 people a week, and next week when we meet back together, your Paul, your trainer, is going to ask you who you shared with and what happened, that changed everything. And by the way, to hold others accountable to do it, we have to do it ourselves. It's a 2-way accountability. They hold us accountable. We hold them accountable. And so what we have found is and by the way, accountability is the missing ingredient in American disciple-making processes. We don't hold people accountable because we know they don't want to be held accountable, and we don't want to chase them off. We have looked at accountability as the means of chasing off those who were not willing and able to do what they're supposed to do. What we're left with are the faithful ones, which 2 Timothy 2:2 says, those are the ones we're supposed to be training. the faithful people, Paul said. So you end up focusing on pouring your life into those who are actually going to do something with it. So the accountability is to us. That's the game changer.
Okay, so you've met, you've done the DBS Bible study, we've prayed together. What's God telling me to do? And then what? Next time you gather together, you're asking, hey, so somebody like, are you writing this stuff down?
Yeah.
Like somebody's.
Yeah, you have a scribe or secretary writes everything down. The next week when you gather, first thing you do, we use the old 3 looks approach: look back, look up, look forward. It's another, sometimes it's called the 3 looks or the 3/3 maybe. So when you meet back together, the first thing we do is we look back at the previous week. What did we say we were going to do? And all right, did we do it? Then we look up. Looking up is the fresh lesson from the next red letter story from the Bible. It came down from above. Then we look forward based on what we just learned from God. What are we going to do with it? So it's look back, look up, look forward. By the way, Greg, that's another reproducible method. The brand new believer, after 2 or 3 weeks, understands look back, look up, look forward. Look back, look up, look forward. So what you're really doing is not just teaching them the Bible and teaching them to follow through on the scriptures, but you're actually teaching them how to lead the next study themselves with those they reach. Make sense?
Perfect. And if you're starting a new church plant now, David, from what you know now, from what you knew then, what would you make your priority in starting a new church today?
I would focus on, put a heavy emphasis on personal evangelism. I believe disciple making begins with evangelism. And once someone came to Christ, I would spend as much time as I could, as much time as they would give me, focusing on raising up that person to become a disciple maker. Remember, Jesus, when he left for heaven, had 120 believers in the upper room. There were a few hundred scattered through Galilee. I know that, but 120 there in the upper room. Those 120 morphed into, within 20, 30 years, they turned the world upside down. It went very rapidly, the growth. But what we often forget is Jesus spent 3 years training those 12. I heard someone say not long ago, Jesus didn't turn the world upside down. The people he discipled turned the world upside down. He did it through them. So now that was a long, slow process, 3 years. He only ended up with 12 minus 1 and the 120 in the upper room. That's nothing to write home about, okay? But those people he trained turned the world upside down within 20, 30 years. And so that's kind of the idea. I would say focus on 10 or 12, and in the next 20, 30 years, you're going to turn the world upside down. Can I illustrate it, Greg? This is
absolutely.
I pastored 3 churches over 37 years: Maryland, Iowa, Florida. 35 years I was a lead pastor. If you take the attendance of those 3 churches and add them together at the time I left, it would total 6,000 people. It took me 37 years of blood, sweat, and tears, hard labor, to reach 6,000 people. This past year, using a multiplication system, after 14 years, we planted a church every 20 minutes. In 1 week, this past year, we reached 10,000 new believers, not that raise their hand and pray a prayer, but are connected to a church. So we are now getting more done in 1 week than it took me 37 years to accomplish. Now, that's the power of multiplication. It doesn't happen overnight. Jesus spent 3 years training those guys, but then it takes off. And so we Americans, we want it like yesterday. We want it real quick. And it bothers us when we start a church and we're only running 100 or 50, and a new church starts and they're running 500 overnight. That kind of bothers us a little bit. And I would say to the guys you're training, focus on the Great Commission. And by the way, whether you ever get big, whether it multiplies or not, Jesus told us to make disciples. That's what we're supposed to be doing.
And if we're being faithful in that,
Yeah.
then we're hearing the well done, my good and faithful servant. I was smiling, David, because you said it's nothing to write home about with the 120, in the upper roomish. And I was just thinking, I just imagine Jesus, writing home and saying, "Yeah, Dad, the church planting efforts down here haven't gone very well. I have about 120 people." And because that's the way we would look at it through our lens a lot of times. Yeah. And yet those were the seeds, because they'd had disciple making embedded in them, that Jesus was able to say, "Dad, I have 120 disciple makers ready to change the world."
Amen. Amen.
And so this is just such important stuff, David. And I'm so thankful for the work that you personally are doing, and all of the Disciples with Timothy initiative, and what we can learn. I love learning from our church planters around the world and how we can help one another, right? It's not those of us who are in the West who have all the answers and are helping the world. I mean, we do help the world in many ways, but yet we need to recognize another paradigm shift, that there's so much that we learn from one another as church planters around the world.
Yeah, and Greg, I think there's much I like about Stadia and you, but that's one of them: your humility, your willingness to learn. And I want to state to your listeners, neither TTI nor myself have ever had an original thought. Okay, everything we teach, we learn from somebody else. So we need to be humble and just accept, hey, maybe there's stuff out there we need to know.
And we're looking forward to our continued partnership. David, listeners, if you want to get involved with the Stadia and TTI partnership, just go to www.stadiachurchplanting.org, and we have lots of information there and would love to talk with you. Hey, David Nelms, my friend and colleague, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Greg. It's a real honor.